not on, because that's embarrassing every time.
With a view.
With a view.
With a view.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Weathersfield Board of Education. Tonight is Tuesday, March 22nd, 2022. We are in the Town Hall chambers. Ellen, can we have roll call, please?
Yes, Chairman Carey. Good evening, everyone. Mrs. DeRoberts?
Present.
Mrs. Drew?
Here.
Mr. Healy? Mrs. Granato?
Here.
Mr. Lacavoli? Dr. Regan Lefebvre? Here. Mr. Riley? Vice Chair, Mr. Cassio?
I'm happy to be here.
Chairperson Carey?
Present.
And Weathersfield High School Student Representative, Ms. Lena Usello.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. If we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and have Dr. Regan Lefebvre lead us. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Student staff recognition, Mr. Emmett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Carey. You know, recently we had the opportunity to enjoy a musical, the spring musical at Weathersfield High School. If you did not get the opportunity to see Cinderella, you missed out. So this evening, we have one of the stars of Cinderella among us sitting up on the dais tonight. So I would like to turn it over at this point in time to our Weathersfield High School student rep, Lena Usello, to talk a little bit about the production.
Well, thank you, Mr. Emmett. Honestly, I've been part of the WHS Drama Department since my freshman year, and as a senior this year, all I can truly say is that it's really been an incredible experience. We've all made so many friendships and so many memories, and like I said in my senior speech during our last show, it kind of like we all just become one big family, and I think we can all say that. But honestly, it wouldn't be possible without, you know, our director, Mr. Rhodes, our dance choreographer, Sarah Hayes, and Mr. Rhodes' daughter, Helen, and his wife for taking over from Ms. Bonzacco this year, and also for Mr. Deane and Mr. Rio, our directors, our assistant directors, and our constructors for the orchestra, who are also amazing. They all just made it possible, and they all make it such a wonderful experience, and I'm definitely going to miss it, but like I said, I've gotten so many friendships from this, and if you want to watch Cinderella, it should be on, I could share it with any of you, but it'll hopefully be up on the Blue Eagles YouTube page soon, so I will let you know when that happens. But yeah, it was a great experience.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments? Yes, Bobby.
I'd just like to ask the question, what were the other productions you were in? Because I know COVID did a lot of damage to our theater.
COVID was definitely tough for all of us, but freshman year, so we did Mary Poppins, which was wonderful. That was a great show. And then our sophomore year, we were supposed to perform The Addams Family, which we were all excited about, but we only had one performance for families before we got shut down for that 2-week period, which led to a little longer. And then last year we had the Cabaret, which was just a mix of all different musicals put into one. So.
Oh, that's great. You were excellent. You're
Thank
a great
you.
stepsister there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts.
I just also wanted to say how much we enjoyed it, my family and I. It was excellent. You did a great job. The acting, the singing, the dancing, just a triple threat. Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Emmett.
Yeah, I just want to say as well, Lena, I happened to go on Friday night, and I have to say I was overwhelmed by just the atmosphere and the environment of that auditorium. What I was really struck by, I was sitting with my wife and my daughter, and we had a family of 4 sitting in front of us. And at one point in time during the performance, the actors and actresses were out in the auditorium.
Yeah.
And I thought it was amazing as I watched this young girl, probably early elementary years, waving to each one of the performers. And as the performers stopped and waited for their cue to take the stage, there was one of the girls that reached out and gave a fist bump to this young lady. And I'm sitting and I'm watching and I'm saying, here is a perfect connection of, our stars, our performers at Weathersfield High School, providing an opportunity for our young thespians for the future. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for a job well done. Your acting skills were fantastic. So, and again, to everybody that was involved in that performance and that production, well done. Thank you.
I will pass that message along. Thank you, Mr. Emmett.
Thank you. Moving on to approval of minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the March 8th, 2022 regularly scheduled meeting?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
With a motion and a second, are there any comments, corrections? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. Public comment. Anyone in the public wishing to make comment, please step to the podium, state your name and address, and you have 5 minutes. Public comments closed. Communications, Mr. Emmett.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Good evening, everyone. A few items this evening. I just want to let members of the public know that last evening I was able to present the board-approved 2022-2023 operating budget to Town Council right here in Council Chambers. We fielded questions and comments from council members. Just want to remind everybody we will come together again on Monday, April 18th for the town-wide budget hearing, which is scheduled for 7 o'clock right here in Council Chambers. It's not a formal agenda item anymore with regard to the COVID update, but nonetheless, through communications, I definitely want to keep everybody informed. The CDC COVID community level for Hartford County continues to be low at this point in time. At the local level, the 14-day rolling average stands at 6.3 cases per 100,000. Weathersfield remains at the yellow alert level. That's actually a drop from the previous week where we were at 8 cases per 100,000. The district continues to have an ample supply of test kits. Again, please do not hesitate to reach out to your child's school nurse to get test kits. One of the things we've done to be preemptive is all of our athletes for spring each got a kit when they started practices, which have started in earnest already. And we have a large group of students who will be participating in the CMEA performances coming up at the Convention Center next week. In the week beyond, so we are providing kits to them as well, just to make sure that we have that mitigation strategy in place. So as we're seeing the weather get nicer and nicer, we're seeing and hearing more kids outside, we're seeing our windows open up. So we continue to monitor very carefully how we're doing with COVID, and the next report for the period of March 21st through March 25th will come out this Friday, the 25th. As the year progresses, the schedule gets more and more busy, and I have to say I'm extraordinarily proud to be able to get out into the community and work with parent groups and see families. Over the past week, I had the opportunity to attend the Yukon Pet Program. This is our 7th pet program since we started our partnership with Yukon. This program empowers parents and strengthens the connection between school and home. Many thanks to Janine Barassi and a recent PEP graduate, Jim Welch, who is now one of our family engagement team members, for coordinating this event. Every year I go, it's one of those events where I think I'm going to be there for maybe 20 minutes to a half an hour, and I'm there for about 2 hours. We have a lot of lively conversation. And also on the opposite end, I had the opportunity to visit the Trinity Church on Main Street, where I was able to reconnect with the Family Learning Program. This is a program that's done in conjunction with VRABI, the Vernon Regional Adult Board of Education, as well as the Weathersfield Public Schools, and it provides an opportunity for our families with young children, even prior to preschool, to come in and have a school-based experience. They get the opportunity, they being the parents, get the opportunity to take language classes to learn English. They are also provided resources for schooling and for jobs. The students get an immersive experience. So last Tuesday, I had the opportunity to participate in a music class. We sang, we danced, we played instruments.
You sang and danced?
I will tell you, I got up and down probably about 8 or 9 times, and I was quite tired at the end of music class. But what was amazing about it, there are pictures. You saw a couple of pictures in the Friday update. And actually what's amazing with this program is you make the connections early on. So in the Friday update last week, I had sent a picture of myself along with a parent and a young man named Justino. And Justino will be joining the Weathersfield Public Schools as a kindergarten student in the fall. I have known Justino since he was like an infant. That's when I first met him. And his mom, Maria, is an integral part of the program and does wonderful work in the district. So it's such a great connection. And I urge you, if you have the opportunity to visit, it is a program that is well worth it. Finally, last but not least, this evening, you don't see them here tonight, but they will be here at the next board meeting, and that is an update on our winter sports. As I mentioned, we're actually starting spring sports, but we enjoyed a little bit of a victory last night. The Weathersfield boys hockey team defeated North Haven 3-0 in the Division II state finals. This is the second time that the Eagles have claimed a state title. We also had a great success with our dance team as well. They performed very, very well at their competition a couple weekends ago. So in April, we expect to have Mr. Maltesi come in with some of our athletes and provide an update on all of our winter sports as well as what's going on for the spring. We certainly have a full slate of sports and activities. And with that, that is communications this evening, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Emmett. Moving on to action items. Ms. Drew, I believe you have a motion for us.
I do. I move that the Weathersfield Board of Education pursuant to Connecticut General Statute, Section 10-215F, certify that all food items offered for sale to students in the schools under its jurisdiction and not exempted from the Connecticut nutrition standards published by the Connecticut State Department of Education will comply with the Connecticut nutrition standards during the period of July 1, 2022 through June 30, 2023. This certification shall include all food offered for sale to students separately from reimbursable meals at all times and from all sources, including but not limited to school stores, vending machines, school cafeteria, culinary programs, and any fundraising activities on school premises sponsored by the school or non-school organizations and groups. And further moved that the Weathersfield Board of Education will allow the sale to students of food items that do not meet the Connecticut nutritional standards and beverages not listed in Section 10-221Q of the Connecticut General Statutes, provided that the following conditions are met. 1, the sale is in connection with an event occurring after the end of the regular school day or on the weekend. 2, the sale is at the location of the event. And 3, the food and beverage items are not sold from a vending machine or school store. Do I have to read the rest of that?
Yep.
Oh.
Yep.
All right. A quote, event is an occurrence that involves more than just a regularly scheduled practice meeting or extracurricular activity. For example, soccer games, school plays, and interscholastic debates are events, but soccer practices, play rehearsal, and debate team meetings are not. The quote, regular school day is the period from midnight before to 30 minutes after the end of the official school day. Quote, location, end quote, means where the event is being held.
Thank you. Do we have a second, or do we need her to repeat that?
Second.
Anybody want to buy water?
Any questions? Mr. Emmett, any discussion?
Yeah, this is an annual requirement of the state of Connecticut, so this is one that comes before the board each year.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none with a motion and a second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. Ms. Drew, I believe you have another motion for us.
I do. This one's shorter. I move that the Weathersfield Board of Education adjust the current number of student days scheduled from 182 days to 181 days for the purpose of completing the student school year on Friday, June 17th.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Emmett?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we're looking at this for this year is with the new recognition of the federal holiday Juneteenth, which will be observed this year on Monday, June 20th. We saw that certainly as a conflict. That would have shifted out the end of the school year to Tuesday the 21st. We felt, given the fact that we'd already set our graduation date, and for our seniors, the last day of school is the 17th, this would be level of consistency for families, as well as planning for staff, as we're going to be getting ready for our summer school programming as well, so it buys us a little bit of extra time. By statute, the state of Connecticut requires 180 days, so we, with our calendar of 182, will still meet the requirement, actually exceed the requirement by a day.
Any questions or comments? All right, seeing none, with a motion and a second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? Motion carries. Thank you. Reports and discussion items. Elementary School Long-Range Building Plan. Mr. Emmett.
Thank you, sir. If I could please have our consultants come to the podium, and I'll join you there.
That means you.
You think we'll ever fix that?
No.
No, it's been like that, I think, since I was on a decade ago.
And you know what?
Was that way last night with council as well?
No, I think it was on a decade ago, it was like that.
I have it in my minutes.
We're working on it. Give us that money in the technology budget. That's on the town side.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I am very happy to be with you this evening, along with our consultants, Mr. Charles Warrington from Colliers and Mr. Mike Zuba from SLAM. And tonight we want to provide you with an update on where we are with our long-range building plan. As you know, we have a flagship high school. Weathersfield High School was completely renovated, and it has been put to great use. We have seen over the past decade with our elementary schools, they have aged. Our elementary schools range from an age of built in 1952 to built in 1973. In many cases, our elementary schools have not seen any significant major renovation. It's been smaller projects. So we looked at an opportunity to look at the long-range planning for our district. And we looked at the idea of being able to do a mix of new building, renovating existing buildings, and actually reducing the number of buildings from 5 to 4. And this is a project that has been in the works for a long time. And we have stopped on a couple of occasions due to budget constraints, and certainly the COVID pandemic kind of created a fly in the ointment, if you will. One of the things I want to be clear with you about here is we understand right up front, this is going to be a huge lift for this town. And we're not going into this lightly. We have done our homework. We have taken the lessons we've learned from the Weathersfield High School renovation project, and we feel that we have a plan moving forward that is going to address the needs of each of our elementary schools and put each of our elementary students in a safe 21st century building where quality learning can occur. We have done an extensive amount of behind-the-scenes work, including a Phase 1 study. That Phase 1 study took a look at our existing buildings and looked at what we would need to repair to bring them back to their current status. So a 1952 Emerson Williams building, how much would it cost to repair that? What would we need to do for heating and air conditioning, roofs, asbestos abatement, and hazardous materials? In addition to that, we embarked upon a 10-year enrollment study, and that work was completed already, and we are here before you tonight to provide you with the update because we have extended out a few years from our original update. In addition to that, we've done a lot of the due diligence work necessary to be able to submit a grant application to the state of Connecticut and ultimately be able to take this project to referendum in the fall. So at this point in time, what I'd like to do is bring forward Mr. Zuba to talk with you about the enrollment study update. Let's talk about where we are with our enrollment and what it's going to look like for the next 10 years.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I see some familiar faces. I know it's been a while since we first kicked this off, and it's good to now finally be out and be able to present everything. So where I always like to begin with our process is kind of walk through the highlights, and tonight's deck is really just the highlights of the work that we've done for not only the 10-year projections, but looking at the demographics in town and looking at how best those demographics align with the school facility plan itself. So really getting into it, I went back and I was really shocked when I was working on it over the last several months to see that we prepared projections way back in 2018. So that was the first time we got together, looked at the 10-year forecast, looked at the number of students projected in. And we've had 2 years of a pandemic since then, so I was curious to see how the projections performed overall. And I was pretty pleasantly surprised to take a look and see that overall for pre-K-12, we were right around 1%. Which, we really strive to be about 1% every year. So this is going out 3 years, and we had very good accuracy, even at the elementary level where working across the state through the pandemic. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I've seen a lot of fluctuations from communities which I thought were similar to Weathersfield to those that I thought were different, and everybody had different responses. And what we're seeing overall in Weathersfield is that even throughout the pandemic, you've been pretty steady overall with your enrollment, where our elementary K-6 enrollment only deviated about 50 students from what we had projected way back in the fall of 2018. We did see some grade changes at the individual school level where our projections had a little bit of a disconnect, and that's really where we dove in as part of this update to really understand what some of those local variables were, especially when we're talking about localized school construction for the elementary schools. But overall, the middle and high school performed fairly well as well. When we started really looking into the highlights of the enrollment drivers, looking at the housing market, which is that far chart on the right, really in Weathersfield focusing on that blue line, which represents the single-family home sales. You've had an uptick, but even before the pandemic, you've been humming along pretty well with the turnover of your existing single-family homes. So you've been up about 30, about 30 sales from where you were prior to that. Condo sales have been pretty steady. We did some hotspot analysis back in 2018. So what that is that's looking at where those home sales are actually occurring. So purchasing through the MLS, the housing sales data by address. It's important to be able to understand that, especially when we're talking about elementary schools that group by neighborhood. So I went back, I re-looked at the analysis, and in the lower right-hand corner, and found that the same pattern that we had looked at prior to the pandemic with where the hotspots were still really in place during and after the pandemic, or whatever phase we're in now. So that was comforting going forward, knowing that the well-established pattern of housing turnover hasn't changed and likely won't change going forward. We did do a birth update, which is that larger chart on the left-hand side. You've had a bit of a birth drop in that 2020. However, what we saw was a strong rebound where you see that dip in recovery, where 2021, which we have almost a full year, it's just marked preliminary, the data has rebounded very well. We ran 3 different birth models going forward in order to generate 10-year projections. We don't know births for 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26. So what we did was we ran 3 different mathematical models. You'll see those lines in blue, green, and red, based on some different assumptions. But overall, they're all averaging between 267 and 295 or so births going forward. So it's really kind of banded pretty well going forward with the births as we're projecting them. I mentioned this to Michael Emmett when our first meeting when we were going over the enrollment. I've looked at enrollment data for almost every community across Connecticut, many communities outside of Connecticut, and I haven't seen 20 years of such stable enrollment as I have in Weathersfield. It really is surprising. It's so much different to see, and I said, going back to the performance on our projections, it kind of make my job a little bit easier when we don't have a lot of these ups and downs and a lot of twists and turns in the enrollment number. But overall, you've been really steady enrollment-wise. I'm looking at the elementary enrollments averaging 1,800 students over the last 5 years. The middle schools at 560, high schools at 1,160. But we do see some localized fluctuations, and that's expected at the individual elementary schools. That's that spaghetti chart that could blind you if you stare at it too much on the right-hand side. What we're seeing there is some growth in Highcrest over the last 5 years. About 50 students, or about 12% overall. Emerson Williams has seen some fluctuation, but a little bit of growth overall in that trend. Hammer enrollment, we saw a bottoming out, but we also saw a rebound. So that blue line right in the middle, where you see it bottomed out in 2021 at just under 310 students, has now rebounded a little bit. Wright has declined over the last 5 years at about 15%, and Webb's enrollment has seen very little change. So we evaluate the individual enrollment at the schools, and we start to tie that to that housing analysis, the housing development analysis, and the overall demographics to really get a good picture of what's likely going to happen going forward. So what this analysis looks at, and this is really more of a deep dive, is I look through the state student IDs as part of the work that we do. We request and we protect the data just by looking at the SACIT IDs, and we actually do an analysis of students that are new to district. So those are based on the student unique identifier in the state, who was in the district prior, who's truly a new student. So, typically in demography, we look at things like net immigration, total number of students. This is begin looking at that individual aspect to see if there's any trends there. And what you'll see in that first stacked bar chart overall is you were pretty steady for the 4 years prior to the pandemic, really in the 200 or so total students overall for the entire Weathersfield Public Schools. The pandemic came, first year of that, you dropped a little bit, but then coming out of that in 21, 22, we saw this pretty large rebound where you're up over 260 students that are new to district. And these are students who, based on their ID, haven't been here before. So that really kind of showed us that you've not only had some increased immigration, but these are truly new students to the district. So then we began looking at, on the charts on the right, where is that occurring? And with pinpoints, what we normally see is a lot of it typically happens at the elementary level, and based on our analysis, you'll see that green part of that stacked bar chart much larger in the elementary. So we really wanted to focus on that. And when we began looking at the grades 1 through 6, we really started seeing that pattern in that top bar chart on the right, where those lower elementary grades, we saw more new to district students coming into Weathersfield Public Schools in this past year than we had in the past. When we're focusing at grades 1, 2, 3, and then we begin sort of looking at the individual schools themselves and seeing how that pattern kind of shapes out. And we're seeing that, really the largest number that we saw was overall in Hammer, looking at the red stack bar chart. That jumped out at me, as well as looking at High Crest, where, really all of them kind of bucked that historic trend, but those really kind of popped, as well as looking at Webb. So we're seeing that within those areas, we're having more new families, more new kids to the district that are moving in. This is an analysis of Weathersfield resident students that are choosing to not only attend other offerings outside of Weathersfield Public Schools, but also now looking at open choice or choice students from outside of Weathersfield coming into Weathersfield Public Schools. So it's really kind of like this slide is a two-way flow of students. I think what the main takeaway from these two key charts are, if you look back in that top bar chart, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you had a greater number of students overall that were seeking opportunities outside of Weathersfield Public Schools. Compared to the last several years, we have much smaller stacked bar charts there, so we're showing that you're retaining, or there's less students that are seeking opportunities outside of Weathersfield Public Schools. And then in the lower right, what that shows us is that 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you had fewer kids that were coming from outside of Weathersfield, mostly Hartford, that are partaking in the open choice or the choice program. Over the last several years, that number has increased. So you're seeing that you're having a greater number of students that are coming in through those choice offerings and becoming part of the Weathersfield Public School community. So all of this really kind of factors into the details that we look at, and then we model this information going forward. And this is just a little bar chart, or a little chart showing the different components that go into the enrollment projections that we have prepared for tonight. Basically, our projections rely on the cohort survival. I won't get into a lot of the details of it. It's a methodology that looks at not only how kids progress from one year to the next, from, say, first grade to second grade, but also from birth to kindergarten. It's really a well-established methodology that takes into account a lot of different things, Maybe not a pandemic, that's something that we had to go in and modify the data a little bit, but it's really one of the most stable methods for giving grade level projections, especially for budgeting as well as school facility planning. So some of our assumptions for the projections that I have for tonight, pre-K enrollment will be just over 70 students for the next 10 years. We're assuming that our same housing conditions that have been pretty stable even before the pandemic, and birth conditions that have been pretty stable before the pandemic, those real enrollment drivers will likely persist. We're also using what we call kind of a variable birth decay, which really just adjusts that historic percentage based on those enrollment drivers for your kindergarten enrollment. So it mathematically models kindergarten enrollment going forward. I've created a set of high, medium, and low. It's something I've been doing since the Great Recession, being able to look at different economic, housing, demographic conditions, and project 10 years. There's a comfort in looking at 3 different sets of assumptions and seeing how well the models align, especially when they're doing facility investments. So our high projections represent about a 3% net increase in students per year. So the net immigration modeled out at about 3%. Your historic average is about 2.3. The medium model is spot on with that, what that's been historically, and then the low model is below that. So what we have for tonight is really the 3 different models. We ran them out going forward for 10 years, looking at pre-K-12 enrollment. And the blue line, really that kind of teal color line, pre-K-12 enrollment for the high model shows that just over 3,900 students. The medium model is at 3,770 students, and then the low model is about 3,500 students. We have good agreement between the high and the medium. Those are pretty close. Our medium model, the one I started off with my presentation, has performed really, really well. Since 2018, that's the model that we're going with. So all the subsequent data that we'll see, you'll be really kind of referencing that, but we really wanted to look at what the likely range of enrollment looks like. With those 2 models really saying that the current conditions that are driving enrollment will likely continue, whereas the low model says that we're going to see some changes that are going to bring less students to the district, which we don't see that being very likely. So projecting out and on the stack bar chart, going with that same methodology there, I have really 3 main bars, and then you'll see that small blue bar on the bottom just represents that steady pre-K enrollment of 71 students going forward. So in the red stacked bar, we're looking at your elementary enrollment. We're projecting the K-6 enrollment to peak in 2029-30 at just over 1,930 students. But overall, it's going to average 1,887 students. This is probably our most important data point, especially talking about an elementary school construction program. But I'll also touch on the middle school and high school, where we're projecting the middle school enrollment to average 573 students over the next decade, a peak of just under 620 in 2030-31. And the high school enrollment is projected to be very stable and average just under 1,150 students over the next 10 years. All right, as part of the elementary school construction program and planning, with looking at the construction program that Chuck will talk about in greater detail, the state requires that any construction project that goes to them as part of a application process, which typically occurs in the end of June of a given year, that you provide 8-year projections. We've developed 10-year projections, so as I work my way through it, you always want to reference only the 8 years for the peak enrollment as part of the construction project, but I did highlight that. When we began this facility plan, we ran numerous options, numerous scenarios, settling in on scenario 4C as those that are best addressing the needs. With that scenario, we had to make some, I'll call it conceptual boundary adjustments, and anytime you're going from 5 elementary schools to 4, you're going to have changes in what those catchments are and what those attendance zone policies are. So we presented, we have a map to present later on, which looks at what that conceptual boundary looks like, as well as having the pre-K enrollment now going over to web as part of this scenario. So you'll see where we're referencing peak enrollment going forward. All of the schools are K-6, whereas web we're presenting as pre-K-6. This was just a starting point that we were using back in 2018, 2019 of understanding how the schools can be organized, how they can be structured, looking at the existing capacity, as well as what the capacity would be, looking at the state space standards. This has been even involved further as part of the development of educational specifications, which are a requirement for a construction grant application, which then looks at this in a more granular detail of how that enrollment would actually fit within the building itself and what kind of spaces would be necessary to support that enrollment and support that capacity. Some of the scenarios that we began looking at, and this has been over a course of several years, we did one scenario which Mike Emmett referenced as just the status quo of, what if we were to just maintain the buildings? What does that look like? Then we looked at modernizing all 5 elementary schools. Then we looked at modernizing 4 elementary schools and keeping them all exactly the same size. So picking a model that best fit and played within that parameter. And then ultimately we settled on really guiding the size of the schools based on the enrollment and based on the sites that they would potentially be on in order to have it where it best fits. So this is where we're looking at modernizing 4 schools. We have a larger high crest, but as you'll see, we have enrollment in the buildings of slightly different size based on either a 2, 3, 4 section per grade model for the given schools. So in talking about 4C, it looks at having really a complement of schools. So with this one, we're planning around 1,930 students for our K-6 peak enrollment. We're also adding the 70 pre-K students or 71 pre-K students on top of that. Webb would be a 3-section per grade school. Really, it would kind of go between 2 and 3 section. Hammer would be 3-section per grade. Emerson Williams, 3-section per grade, and Highcrest at 4. The different color blocks are indicating that both Hammer and Highcrest, and shown in the green, those would be new construction, so a new build, whereas Webb and Emerson Williams in the teal color, those would be renovated as new projects. And as part of that, we're just laying out, this isn't a very detailed construction program, but for our space planning and for our enrollment projections, looking at how that would lay out. So in the first phase of this project, there would be a new Hammer built on the Board of Ed site adjacent to the existing building. The old building would be demolished once it opens. A new Highcrest would then be built on the northern portion of the site. The old Highcrest now would serve as swing space in order to be able to support all the subsequent construction projects. The old Highcrest building would be demolished once all the phases were complete. Phase 2 is envisioned as a renovate for Emerson Williams. That would be a renovate as new. Students could swing over to that old Highcrest during the renovation, so you don't have a need for an occupied renovation. You don't have a need for students on the site itself. Phase 3 would be a renovation of Webb. The Webb students would also swing over to that old Highcrest school, and then Charles Wright would close once the entire construction program was completed. As part of being able to go through the space planning to generate projections to satisfy the State Office of School Construction Grants and Reimbursement, as well as to be able to inform the development of the educational specifications, we looked at creating this 4-school alignment for the conceptual boundaries. So what you'll see with the closure of Wright, right in the middle in the blue box, off to the, I guess it would be the upper northeast corner, we started to go ahead and identify really 5 major areas of change that would have to occur. It moves about 30% of the student body, and this isn't a swing space plan. This isn't a phase. This is looking at today versus once all the construction is complete. There's pockets of students that are being moved. It's not just the students that would be at Charles Wright due to the consolidation. They would move to the neighboring. We had to move and really realign the boundaries overall to have sustainable enrollment overall, but this is what it looks like conceptually. I won't spend a lot of time to get into a lot of the details of that, but what it did for us was it was able to provide us with the areas that we were able to then to go ahead and do our enrollment projections. So, I talked earlier about the detailed demographics at the different neighborhoods, at the different areas. We really began then to plug that information into what those new conceptual boundaries were and looked at what the projected enrollment's going to look like if those areas are captured in there and what it would look like going forward. So that black box shows us our 8-year window. So that's really looking at an 8-year projection window. If a school construction grant application goes in for June 30th of this year, we project out 8 years. That takes us to the fall of 29-30. We pick then, within that window, the highest projected enrollment to begin really doing that more detailed, that really detailed analysis that Chuck will talk about in a few minutes. But overall, Hamburg is looking at a peak enrollment of 377 students in 27-28. Emerson Williams, peak enrollment of 465 students in 29-30. Highcrest hits their peak enrollment in 23-24, 644 students. And then Webb, as a pre-K 6, has a peak enrollment of 524 students in 29-30. And with that, maybe I'll pause if you had any questions on the first part, or do you want? Yeah, I'll pause and see if you have any questions on the enrollment projections first before we get into the cost estimates and the construction.
Thank you so much. Any board members with questions? Yes, Dr. Regan-Lefebvre.
Thank you very much for all this information. I have a question about pre-K population.
Yep.
You had that number projected of 70. That is based on the current enrollment at Webb. It's not the preschool age population.
Exactly.
So if we were in a scenario where we were expanding pre-K education in Weathersfield, either because there was federal support or we decided to as a town, would we have any swing space in this scenario to accommodate more pre-K students?
I think what would happen is we would, if you were to go in that direction and you would have a number for us, that number would then look at what it would be from, does it fit in the renovated Webb, would be the first main question. And then what would it take to add the additional space based on the number that you want to be able to open it to? And it's a great question. I know a lot of districts are talking about universal pre-K, funding coming down the pipeline. It would be, we would look to you for that information of saying, what would you look to be able to expand to pre-K wise? And then we would look at what would be able to fit within the building program and see if you have a strong desire within 10 years to go universal pre-K, then that becomes a different equation. If it's looking of adding a couple sections or expanding it, say 20% or so, that's something that we would then include in this master plan for the schools in order to be able to build to that. Mm-hmm. Pre-K isn't something that we ever project. What we find in our experience is between the local pre-K offerings, the area pre-K offerings, as well as the district-wide ones, if you provide a seat, you will have a student for that seat. So it's not really like a guesswork or a projection like a kindergarten where we're trying to project the exact number. If you provided space for it, the program for it, you will fill that seat.
Okay. And can I just ask as well, did I see when you talk about having 3 sections per grade level at 3 of the schools and 4 at Highcrest, that's based on about 25 maximum per class?
Yep.
Okay. Which is, I think most of us would feel is undesirably large, but it's the working number.
The working number, I actually did a 90% of 25. So 25 was the cap, and then we assumed that we would use 90% of the seats, not 100% of the seats.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Roberts.
Just as far as Jennifer's question was, I'm pretty sure that Chuck can answer that, because we've talked about what happens if the government says, okay, everybody's there is going to be universal pre-K. And from what Chuck has explained to us, is that the state isn't interested in what could happen, as far as it won't approve something that isn't there. But Chuck will explain more about the additions, right? Do you think
if you want
yeah.
to let me jump in real quick,
Go.
it'll be easier. Chuck Warrington, Director of Project Management, Colliers. So in addition to what Mike said as an option, SAFE it came down the road during the design of the first 2 schools, and that's the concern is we're passing a budget. You have an ed spec and a program, and one of the options, because if you build this and they pass it after you finish Highcrest, and you go, well, it's too late, we're already done, right? We already built this building. Some of the strategies that we can employ is when we go out for services for the designer, for the architect, we can tell them, identify a location for, say, 4 classrooms, a wing on the site. It's a simple dash line on a plan, but what we do is we plan for that for the future. We don't run underground utilities gas lines, electric lines that we would have to relocate after the fact. If it came about, we'd have it identified. Ideally, we're just extending the building. Hopefully architecturally, we can make it fit because if anybody's done addition to a house, that's always a challenge. No different for a school. But you size those utilities within the building, your heating, your hydronic lines, your sewer lines, air conditioning, all that, to accommodate for those 4, maybe 6 classrooms, but now you're not having to redo work. So hopefully it's as simple as digging the hole, extend your foundation, tie it in. It's going to look a little different because it's going to be aged. But if it's in the midst of that, that's one strategy that we can employ. Probably more so at Highcrest. Hammer depends because that, when you look at the test fit, it's a little bit tighter site. So we might be a little more challenged there, but we might be able to identify, we did it in another district where we identified vertically, going 3 classrooms, we'll just add in 3 more. And actually, we did build it that way in that district. So there's strategies to kind of manage, but as you alluded to, the state can't approve overbuilding because otherwise every 169 districts in the state would probably overbuild at this point, unfortunately.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Ms. Drew.
So can I ask you a question about when Charles Wright closes and it moves over? I was looking at the map, and then when you looked at the projections, it looks like at Emerson Williams, only an additional 60 kids are going. Am I looking at that right?
Yes, we're projecting it over.
So how are you, where are the kids going? So I know that it's
The
majority of it over at Emerson. I'm thinking in my head. So.
I know exactly where you're going. So what I did with this projection, even when you see 21-22, it's a little confusing. So 21-22, I reallocated the existing students today based on these future boundaries.
Okay.
So everything that you see on this chart is based on those future boundaries. So even though kids right now are in Charles Wright, I reassigned them in this chart based on these boundaries. So I took it and reallocated all the kids and then reran projections to see how it would, how it would lay out mathematically and what the projections would look like. So the growth that we're showing are based really on those new catchments and attendance zones. So that projected future growth doesn't think about the phasing of the plan. It shows how many kids would be there if you were to just plop down and say schools are built.
So it's just today. So like I'm a Charles Wright mom.
Yeah.
So my daughter would be in Emerson Williams today,
Yeah.
and that's based upon the growth. So okay.
Exactly, but it's not saying like at that point in time when it closes, how many kids would actually be in there and what that would look like. It's silent to that. It's not It's not like a true swing space plan because we don't know exactly to an exact certainty of when each of those events, especially the renovation projects later on, would exactly happen to say there's going to be so many kids there that we would have to move and swing. So I think what this plan shows you is that if you were somehow magically able to make all the schools constructed today and put the kids down and project forward, that's exactly what it looks like, and that's what your enrollment looks like.
No, I get it now.
Yeah.
It's just that the numbers weren't reading right to me, so I get it.
All right.
In this plan, I think, Mike, and I don't know if you're going to touch upon it,
Yeah.
more cumulative. So in phase 1, High Crest is being built bigger.
Yeah.
And we're building new hammers, so I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, once they're completed, those final numbers will, I think part of Charles Wright's going to Hammer.
Yep.
And some of Emerson and Webb is probably going to High Crest.
Yeah, so,
Does that sound right?
yeah, great point. So what we're showing here, and I was squinting at the little screen, but I'll actually bend down so I could see it and give you the real numbers. So what this shows you, especially if we work in kind of a clockwork fashion, and we start to say at like 2 o'clock, that leader line going into the giant blue area around Wright is showing that about 180 kids from Charles Wright that exist today would go into Emerson Williams. And then working down to about 4 o'clock, where we're pointing to that red area, it's showing that an area of existing area of Emerson Williams would move over to Highcrest, and there's about 65 students there. And then I ran demographics to show what that would look like. 65 becomes something else with the growth. But this gives us our most certain numbers because I know I have students in homes today.
Charles Wright's going to Webb too?
Yeah, and then we have this small little area at about 7 o'clock where it's about 80 students are going from Webb to Highcrest, and then working up to about 11, 12 o'clock, we have Emerson Williams to Webb. That's that one at about 11 o'clock. There's 150 students there, and then finally, up right along the border with Hartford, we have Wright to Webb, which is about 90 students. So these were just major planning blocks in order to create conceptual numbers. When it would be time to implement this, you would take another look and see if there's any tweaks, see if anything changed demographically. But this was really just to be able to create cohesive attendance zones and then populate the school in order to be able to see what size we needed.
Well, if we change the lines, would that change our projections?
If you change the lines, it would change the projections a little bit, but what we do with this process is, as you get closer to the day of implementing the new redistricting boundaries, we would go back and take a look at the enrollment, see how well it's matching up. So I know from reviewing your enrollment from back in 2018 to today, the projections withstood a pandemic and they look pretty good. So I would say as we get closer to the day of actually implementing the redistricting, once the construction's complete, we would then take a look at the enrollment and see if we need to make any adjustments, and if not, make those adjustments. But if not, we'd be able to just kind of adopt these boundaries as the boundaries for the schools going forward.
One of the things that we did have regarding that whole boundary issue was that it was going to be one and done.
Yeah.
We're going to just
Yeah.
redistrict once. We're not going to continually do redistricting. So it's going to be a situation that we have to monitor and keep an eye on.
And that was one of the purposes of keeping the old Highcrest, having that building to be able to be used as swing space. So having students not only in non-occupied sites for construction, but having everybody swing in through that building. You don't have to do a phase redistricting at all. So we're not moving kids in various steps along the way. It's just really, once everything's done construction-wise, you go through and then you readjust all the boundaries.
And Amanda, your second grader will probably graduate from high school by the time this project is done.
Stop it.
John, I don't know if it's on that much of a timeline, but
Yes, Ms. Granado.
I just wanted to get back to pre-K, because that's always on my mind, and I know it did not pass in infrastructure at all for the federal pre-K. But we've talked about this in our committee, that we want to keep it in our minds that there's a possibility, and that's why, as this program moves along, this plan moves along, Webb, because it does have all this land, could possibly be the pre-K center for the town. And it's all in the timing of this. You know, we can't go to the state and say we'd like pre-K and then not have the children there, and they're going to give us money for empty classrooms. They will not. But the foresight we need to have is that there will be a pre-K and that we will have room at Webb for it.
Yes.
Can I go back to the map for a second? I'm just thinking about what Amanda said. Obviously, we don't want to be drawing the map tonight in this kind of forum, but there are some cultural issues to take into account, because I can see how kids who are currently in Charles Wright, really on the Hartford line, are going to feel slighted having to go to Webb when Hanmer is physically much closer and is a really nice walk, and there's a real culture of walking to school. So these are some trade-offs, and they might be worthwhile trade-offs when we consider the kind of facility that we'll get out of it and how good it will be. But if we were to say, you know what, we don't want to have a scenario where students are more than a certain distance, that would absolutely affect the planning.
Yeah, and it doesn't change the construction program. So
Yeah,
we're
okay.
planning around the district-wide enrollment, that peak 8-year enrollment for all pre-K 6 students right now. But you're right. I mean, you go through, if you're changing boundaries, you want to go through a thoughtful, inclusive process. You want to put some criteria around what you want to be able to accomplish. And that's when you can be able to go in and say, does this make sense from a walker parent standpoint? And then the other lens that we typically work through on is working with transportation, of saying, if I'm going down this area, does this save me a bus if I were to make a couple changes here? We could really reduce transportation costs. And if this were just a straight up redistricting, that's the things that we would be kind of looking at. But we're not 10 years away, as John mentioned, but a number of years away that you would want to be able to do that fine-tuned planning when it was right out in front of you.
Okay, so it will not affect the budgeting at this point. If we were to say 5 years from now, you know what, actually, we're not really happy with how this looks. Can we move more students to this school?
If there's space, it can be done.
I mean, again, I think, and what Bobby was saying earlier is like, we have to work with the projections we have and with the actual curriculum we have, but we want to make sure we haven't locked ourselves into a scenario that's not flexible.
Yeah, and some of it is the site itself of saying, how large of a building can be fit on that site and how many students can we have in there? So that was part of it too, with that area that I know that you're kind of the area up north of saying, well, can we fit all of them in the site on Hammer? And the question is, no, that entire block can't go, but can some adjustments be made around the edges and some adjustments be made over here, where we end up with roughly the same enrollment that we're designing to, but the kids are just coming from different areas. That's the way I kind of view the process.
Okay. And of the 4 sites, the only one that has serious space constraints is Hanmer.
From what we've seen, yeah,
okay.
that seems to be the tightest one, based upon the test fits that we did a couple years ago. So that would, it's more of a cautionary note that we might be challenged there to find that dotted box, if you will,
Okay.
to add more
Thank
onto
you.
that one.
But as of now, we're talking about the peak enrollment being 377, did I say?
Yeah, tweak down a little bit.
Yeah, tweaked down a little bit, 377, but when it's designed and constructed, that number then may be 390 or 395, or something a little bit more when you're actually going through the process of creating the boundaries.
I think
And the other,
370 is out, too. I think that's a little bit far.
It's
just
out.
the other bit of information is that we, have our ed specs and our student enrollment and a design situation in front of us. We have to wait until what the state actually approves. So what we may have is, it's a plan.
Yep.
And it has to be flexible, because the state may come back and say, building's too big, and, doesn't meet our specs. You have to go back to the drawing board. So, yes, this is just a working document right now. We've been working on it for how many years?
4?
Quite a while.
Quite a while.
Yeah.
All right. Chuck?
Anything else?
Chuck?
All right. So we get the fun part. So when Mike gets done with his work and doing the projected enrollments, we start going to that next step. We've had, 3 phases, I think? I think we're all close to phase 4. And what the enrollment projections do a couple things. One, they tell us how much the state of Connecticut's willing to reimburse. That's probably, from a taxpayer's perspective, the most important. They call it the space standard, and it's basically a calculator that we take the number of students, and depending on what range we fall in, they have a graph, and we plug those into a spreadsheet, and it basically tells us what they're willing to reimburse for. And I say reimburse, and I stress that because sometimes folks get confused with whether they're willing to help us build, and it's really a reimbursement function statutorily. Anytime, just so anybody knows, if you build over that, technically, they take a ratio. They'll say, this is what we calculate to build. For example, 90,000 square feet. Use a district want to build 100,000 square feet. So that ratio is 0.9. What they're technically supposed to do is take the 0.9 and multiply that, apply that to your reimbursement rate. Whatever that percentage. Right now, it's roughly 46% for new.
Yes.
And you'd multiply the 0.9 times the 46%, and then that would be your effective reimbursement rate against eligible costs. Key thing, eligible, there's always going to be ineligible costs in every project, even a new. Some districts are under the impression that everything's eligible. Anything outside the property line's ineligible. There's certain change orders that will be ineligible, certain FF&E that gets purchased, smallware items that are not worth a 20-year bond, they're not going to make that eligible. So we kind of put that stipulation on it because when you do, if you calculate, 100 million, just using that times 46, you think 46 million, you're not going to get 46. It's going to be less than that due to ineligibles for that. But, so we move on. So we've been working on our final budgets. Mr. Dan Hansen, who is an educational specialist that we recommend, a former educator, assistant superintendent, has been helping the district develop their educational specifications. Now, where it's been different from even past June, where we publish kind of high-low numbers and we call probables, those were based upon purely enrollment numbers. And applying factors for overbuilding a bit, building right to the ed spec or to the space standard below, and then somewhere in between where it's a little bit higher but not so high. Now that we have space standards, we have the program. We know how big your buildings want to be, and that program drives our budgets. It drives about 75 to 80% of your budget, which is what we call the hard costs or construction costs in layman's terms. That consists of your building, it consists of your site work, and most importantly these days, escalation. And if anybody's been paying attention, which I'm sure we all are, we know escalation's pretty high and volatile right now. So that's one area we're paying particular attention to with the facilities committee, and it's a discussion we're going to have with your town as a whole to collectively understand what do we all feel is a reasonable amount of escalation for your budget, so we're not too high, but we're again not too low. Because the worst thing we could do is come back for more money in any district. Escalation, I think we've all seen it, obviously in gas prices. We've seen them at Home Depot if anybody goes there and buys materials for their house. Just food, everything is up. We recently received bids since last June, a couple projects, but one in particular that's a new elementary school, comparable size and scope to what you're going to build. Came in around $400 a square foot. We were budgeting previously for about $350, $365 a square foot. So just that delta alone is impacting us right now. We're aware of it. We're constantly talking to our construction manager and professional estimators that we work with to see where they're trending. So that's being an impact as well. As you can see on the screen, we've updated our estimates, and these are in draft form. They're constantly changing. I think, if anything, they're probably going to come down a little bit. The high estimate we had for Highcrest was almost $60 million for that school. We're currently showing a proposed budget about $62 million. So, and that's based upon the ed spec we have now. Again, some of those factors are, again, unit price cost per square foot, escalation costs. We're using, I think, Adam Levitas, by the way, is my colleague working with us. We're using 5% right now. So that could uptick. I know the current, it's around 7 to 8, but is that going to last? We'll have to kind of talk about that and see how we apply that. And then we're also applying more owner's contingency. Again, for some of these unknowns, worst thing in these projects is to come in over budget and then have to go back out. We were fortunate in the recent one that came in over budget. Their program had previous projects that we had savings on, and their referendum allowed us to transfer those savings up to that project by law and with a town council vote and keep that project moving forward. But we're kind of lucky with that one, I think. Good project management.
A clarification question?
Sure.
For your high estimate for Highcrest, you originally had it at 59.9.
Mm-hmm.
Is the high estimate now 62, or is that your median?
That's what we think the budget will be right now based upon it. That is the budget. It's not a high or low. It's actually based upon our ed specs as they are written today.
And that's as of today, if we got the referendum today?
Correct. Yep. We don't see that fluctuating much, other than the one thing that's not included in that are financing and bonding costs. We need to get those from the Department of Finance, because every town does bond their projects differently. So that's not included in that number. It could be, it all depends. I've seen these projects be 1.3, 1.5 million and 200,000. All depends on cash flow and everything else going into the town and how you finance in the town and your modeling, financial modeling.
I just have a clarification. Is there another slide after this one?
I believe so, yeah, our next steps.
Okay.
Yep.
So the estimated projected costs, I just need some clarification. Throughout this time the committee has been meeting, we've discussed the ideas of Webb and Emerson Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see them on this slide, and at our last facilities meeting, we discussed that. And can you just share why we're not seeing that? Because we had, we indicated that we wanted to see that, what Webb and Emerson would cost us, because we, as a committee, have been referring to this as a single referendum.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
and I just don't want to confuse the whole issue here with the board. And, I think with that being said, I think we need clarification on that.
Mm-hmm.
We need to know what direction we're going in, because, we're
I'm a little confused at the moment.
yeah, I'm just, I've spent a lot of time on this committee, and that's basically what we've been talking about. And so I just need clarification on that.
Yeah, so we do have the previous, for those two schools, we do have the high-low probables that we did before. The reason we don't have the probable estimate similar to Highcrest and Hammer One is we don't have ed specs. We never initiated those to be completed. To do a final budget, we need an ed spec. So that's one reason why we don't have those right now. We'd still be providing more of a high-level estimate, a probable, with a bit of a guess on what your square footage would be. So in order to complete those, we need to have the educational consultant prepare ed specs for those.
So is that something that we're going to be doing?
We could be, it's at your direction. If you want to do it, we can do it, but that's something we can do, but we just haven't initiated that. We have numbers where we think they'll be based upon the enrollment projection numbers that we have. And I'm just bringing that up now to see if.
I think, unless I'm in a different meeting, we have been discussing it, that we thought all 4 schools were going to be in one referendum. So I would consider that those ed specs would be started or thought about, and, just want to make sure I attended the right meetings.
Yeah, no, we agree, John. It just, we don't have ed specs. We'll need to get ed specs for those, or we assume, we go based upon our projected, the space standard with a factor on to that.
So Chuck, we have enough time in order to get these ed specs for Emerson Williams and Webb in time for when we have to bring this to the state? Which is soon?
Yeah, we'd have to talk to the consultant, number one. 2, I don't, other than, correct me, Samuel Webb, that's got pre-K? I suspect that the base ed spec will be very similar for K-6. Your general classrooms, art rooms, music rooms. I'd assume those would be similar, with that difference being that special program.
So we could get this done then?
As long as we get on it right away.
Okay.
We can do it, and we can get on it right away. As long as I have the square footage number, we can do it. By due caution, that number, it's not going to be accurate. I'm going to be honest. With the volatility of the market right now, I'm very concerned about having to come back to your town for more money down the road.
But that would be the same with these two also?
Not so much.
Not so
We have to have a
much?
discussion, an active discussion, once you vote in the referendum there, but if you're out 6, 7 years from now, I don't think anybody has that good of a level of predictability on the cost factor. In 2 years, it's been highly volatile. So, at least from our perspective, there's going to be a big asterisk on it going, that can change quite a bit.
I don't want to speak for the whole board, but I think from our perspective, it's very important that we have a single referendum. And I suppose we have to word it in a way that allows for inflation and this volatility, because you're right, none of us, we've all experienced this personally. We don't know what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years. But I think we understand politically how nearly impossible it would be to go back to the town and to ask for a second referendum to finish what is supposed to be one single project. So I'm new to the board this year. I'm also not on the facilities committee, but if we need ed specs to get an approximate number so that we are as best informed as we can be, then we need to do that now. And I don't understand what we need to do. Do I need to make a motion? Does it have to come out of the facilities committee? Because if what we're hearing is we need those ed specs to have a semi-accurate, or as accurate as we can be at this point, number, then we should do that, right? So what has to happen right now? Because we all want this to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the budget. I don't know if, Michael, you want to speak to
So
that.
with regard to the educational specifications for Webb and for Emerson Williams, we are carrying enough money in the Phase 3 to be able to do that.
Okay.
So we can be able to do that. and that would be done through Dan Hansen. Dan is currently wrapping up the educational specifications for both Hanmer and Highcrest, they are both new builds.
Okay, so do we as a board need to do anything to move this along so that we have that information for June, or do you think we're all set?
I think we're all set within
Okay.
the current allocation of Phase 3 dollars. I think we're set, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one question, a clarification? So what is the reason for the dramatic increase for the cost of Hamner and not for Highcrest?
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Yep.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yep. No problem. No worries. By the way, so once we have even the space armor, not even the whole ed spec, just to clarify the chart, that's all we need. We don't need the whole thing finalized, drafted, and approved for the ed spec. So it should be quick, and we already have our estimates already drafted. We just plug the number, and everything else pretty much takes care of itself. So it's quick for us once we have that, just to reassure you. Going back to Hammer, so one of the big issues, so when we did our original numbers for Hammer, again, we used the space standard number, and what we use for a low is building to the space standard, because we rarely see it below the space standard. And that's what the state says for these many students, we're willing to reimburse. On the high side, we added 10% to that, saying we're going to grow that by another 10%, under the premise that in the previous OSCGR administration, which if you guys have been watching, the news, that has changed recently. Under that previous administration, when we developed those numbers, had we gone into with a grant application with a space standard ratio less than, on a new school, 92, 93% roughly, they probably push it back and they would tell you that they're not going to put it on the priority list, which means you wouldn't have a project. Okay. That's the previous administration. Now that appears to be changing again. So under that premise, our current space standard is around an 80%. We're working on the ed specs and looking where we can drill down. There's a lower enrollment hammer. Okay, so that's kind of leading to it. When you have lower enrollment, you got lower space, but you still have your OTPT, your reading specialists, all your programs you need to support that program, but in a smaller building with a smaller population. So your kind of your volume, your efficiency is a little bit less with those. Part of it again goes back to the cost per square foot. Number one, two, our enrollment's down a little bit. I think 20 students, maybe a little bit, but it's cost per. It's that square foot cost. Again, escalation and contingencies. A lot of it's the square foot of the building is higher than what we projected.
If we looked at moving some of the students from Charles Wright, that block area, would that change the ratio that would allow us to receive a little bit more reimbursement?
We talked about, I think, that a little bit today. So it would increase, if you increase the number of students, it's going to increase the ratio, but we have to see what that does to your program, because that may uptick you to another classroom or two throughout the grades, because I know you go from like grade 1 to grade 2 to 3.
I think I would need to,
We have to look at that closely.
I think it's not just a few students. I think we'd have to move a fairly significant number, and then it becomes, can it all fit on the site? So it becomes this question of, and I forget where the threshold was it 425 I needed to get to? For the space standard?
350 to 750 was the next metric.
Oh, all right. So
We're in a large.
We're in a large span, so we would actually have to reduce enrollment further to try to put, it's going to be a give and take with a lot of different variables to try to tune that number in. One of the concerns that we had talked about was what if pre-K went there, right? But then would we have enough of site to be able to accommodate pre-K on it with using that 70 to push the enrollment up? So I think there's going to be a look at shaving some square footage from each space to try to right-size it there and see if there can be adjustments in enrollment to be able to get that number closer to where they want. I think there's going to be several factors at play to try to tune that number in over the next few weeks, to be honest with you. It's just a function of the amount of space. It's the space standards are designed for schools of a certain size, and if you have a school that's a tweener school within that 375 range, it's really hard to provide everything that you need to provide from an educational standpoint, because that takes square footage when you don't have the enrollment to offset it. So it becomes this bit of a puzzle, to be honest with you, of trying to manipulate to get that number right where it needs to be.
What happens to the reimbursement rate as the space number goes down?
According to the statute in the state, the reimbursement rate will be reduced by that ratio unless you get, and we'll be submitting, I suspect, what we call space waiver request, at least for some of it. I don't think we're going to get to 100%, to be honest. I think we're too low, but I think we can get some of it back to justify why do we need to overbuild. And I think we can justify some of that. We were talking a little bit today. We suspect, again, we'll have to get the space summaries for the other two schools, that this is probably going to be the one-off in the whole program. I don't suspect it's going to be like that for Williams and Webb. We'll have to submit a space standard waiver request for part of it. To get to 100%, I'd be surprised. We have to do a lot of deep cuts to get to 100% ratio.
And to get that space waiver, we then have to include our elected officials, our state rep, senator, that represent Weathersfield.
There's two different ones. There's an administrative one through OSCGR. Then there's the other one that's called notwithstanding legislation. There are two different paths to take. The previous administration was looking to avoid the notwithstanding legislation. They wanted you to come through their office and basically control spending. They were trying to control state spending is all it came down to. But that, again, that has changed. And we, like yourselves, are kind of learning, okay, what's the new norm for this right now? And it's changing the game, and we're kind of learning and readapting right now to understand what they're going to do. It doesn't sound like they're going to stop anybody from going on the list or saying we're not going to put you on it like it was before. They didn't say that, but that's kind of the feel we're getting from them. But there may be an impact to your reimbursement rate that will educate you too of what that could potentially be, so that you're making an informed decision.
I just have an additional question, and I know it's thinking down the road, but being that Hamner is located in a historical district, will we have to keep in mind the historical society when we get into the design? Okay.
Yeah, all local regulations you have to comply with, 100%.
What's the highs for Webb and Emerson Williams?
If you just bear with me, I'll bring those up. Williams, hello, probable. So, and Adam, we updated the probable on the enrollment projection, right? Does that sound right?
For Emerson and Webb, it was, should have just had the high in there and left it the probable.
Okay.
Government tab.
Yeah, the one you just updated. March probably is one of the high enrollment, 461. Why don't you come up here and just make sure before I'm getting it right. That's recheat there. Okay. Yep. Yeah, we'll bring that up. These are constantly changing here. And we'll pull up the one from the from last June, just to give you a sense of context. Okay, so the high for Emerson Williams that we had, this is from June of 2021, just to clarify. The high was 42.7 million with a low of 28.1. Again, this is last year, and the web was 45.1 million with a low of 33 million.
And you think since they're renovations, they're probably going to be kind of in flow with High Crest, and Hamner's just our bad child?
I think so, because they have a higher enrollment. They're the 468, and these might have tweaked a little bit. High 400s in enrollment, so we're getting a larger building. So you're when you take an administration space in office, serving 377 or 468, that
Right.
office size doesn't change too much. Your nurse's office, your OT, PT, some of those common programs and spaces, mechanical space, it's not going to be twice as large. It's going to be very, very similar. Corridors and such will be similar for those. But again, these are using older cost per square foot numbers, lower, those are 3.5% escalation that we've seen over many years.
Right. Yeah, I'm
as
just
well.
concerned because it's a $3 million increase for High Crest, but, it's 14.
Hammer's an outlier because of what we use for the high and the low, again, under that premise that the state was saying, hey, if you come in under less than 9%, don't even submit.
Right.
That was kind of the writing
Right.
on the wall.
But Webb and Emerson Williams are not in that same category. They're more closely related to High Crest.
I think so, and again, we need to see that space summary with the ed spec. That's why it's so vital, because you're seeing the delta with
Right.
Hammer. That's why it's really, really important to see that space summary in the programming and get those understood. Again, the highs, we added 10% to the space standard, given what the state was telling us. To go any higher was really not falling in line with what we're kind of being told.
Right.
if
Yeah,
you will.
my
Yeah.
only concern is when we go to referendum, I just don't want it to escalate to a point where it's,
Oh,
because
certainly.
again, because Webb and Emerson are renovations and they're later on, so that's my concern. It's a very large project and it scares me a little. So.
Understood, yeah, that's, going from, 38 to 52 is a big jump.
Yeah.
And it's mostly square foot driven. Again, we're at 10%, we're in around 80% versus 90%, so there's 10% right there. There's a lot of square footage associated with that.
Right.
But we're working on it, we're looking at areas to trim it, and understand, why is there the difference?
So this is Adam Levitas with Colliers also. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is partially why Emerson, Williams, and Webb weren't shown today, is we are meeting to have a thorough, deeper dive into some of these budget estimates because they're so volatile. And as Chuck alluded to earlier, one of the biggest topics is going to be escalation. So because those projects would be slated later in construction, escalation has a far more rampant effect.
Right.
So if, for example, you see High Crest, it increased but not as much, largely due to the fact that the ed specifications when they came in had a very favorable space program summary. It was actually lower than our high estimate was going to come in. So you could say that the efficiency of the building took a bite out of some of the escalation that would come in, and it only increased by 3%. On the flip side of that, you have Hamner, which had larger space requirements, and therefore it's sort of Hamner was more expensive than we thought, and High Crest was lower. Although Emerson, Williams, and Webb, they might be closer to that middle range, there's still the impact that escalation is going to have where, we're only projecting out 3 years for construction for phase one. For those later phases, you have, 5, 6, 7, 8 years to get to the midpoint of construction. That's going to have a far outsized effect. So we wanted to get a better wrangle, talk with the town, and have a better sense of how we want to project those figures out, rather than project a number that might be far larger, even though we have some reasonably right-sized space programming.
Okay. Thank you.
Well said.
Chuck, if you take the high of Emerson, Williams, and Webb, and you add it up, it's about $202 million. I just did the math. You can trust me on that one. So, have you ever been involved in a town that has a referendum that large for this scope of
What was
projects?
that number again?
202.
202? I think certain districts certainly have, depends, but if you're talking for a program like this with multiple, like elementary schools?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, I don't know, Mike, if you had, I'm sure there has been,
The
though.
largest one I've personally been involved with was 2014 in Groton. We did the master plan and passed a $186 million referendum, which involved 2 new elementaries and a new unified middle school. And that was after 2 or 3 failed referendums
Those
before.
were magnets. One of them was a magnet, right?
Yeah, one was,
Magnet.
it got a higher reimbursement percentage.
80% reimbursement too.
But that would probably, and I know at the time, that was one of the largest referendums that had passed.
And what was the experience in South Windsor, Chuck? They
we
went
were-
out for multiple referendums, right?
Yeah, they
What
did
happened
3. They went with an original one, actually, I believe they went with one full one to start.
And that didn't pass.
That didn't pass. Not sure the reasons, we weren't involved.
Right.
For it, I think that was, I want to remember, I want to say 108 million was, but I wasn't around, so I'm guesstimating. So they did go out with one for all of them originally. It didn't pass, and then it got restructured and reorganized with the current superintendent to do a 3 referendum, a 1-2-1, build a new one. They were actually going to do a new reno and then a final reno, but they went all new after the first project. They were they've been fortunate there. That was the one we came in over budget on the final one, but luckily to good project management or all around, we saved about a little over $3 million to transfer some into that, keep it going. So
You have to remember, though, South Windsor also had 7 elementary schools that they were working with. 5
same
they
as yours,
closed.
they had 5. They went 5 to 4.
Okay,
very
they were
very similar.
And they were closing some.
Yep.
And that's why they went 3 referendums. I just have this fear that if we do one referendum, we're going to end up with just one referendum. And if we did 2 referendums, we were just going to end up with 1 referendum. That's my fear. And I'm not saying anything negative about the people. You just, if you pass for all 4 schools, I think you're going to have the population of schools' parents, school children's parents behind us. I think if you divide, I don't believe that we're going to get that referendum into.
Yeah, and again, your decision. We're not endorsing either way.
Yeah. I'm just so nervous about that we'd end
We
up
can
with
provide
2
a
new
number, just
schools.
it's more volatile as we go out and a little bit more unknown. And as long as we're having a conversation with yourselves and town council and understanding, hey, here's what the factors are, this is what we know right now. And, you're pretty steady, so I don't suspect the enrollment to grow much, like South Windsor, I think we talked, they had a large enrollment spike. So we were challenged with that throughout. Their last school is supposed to be the largest, it's now going to be the biggest. It just, things can change. We're using 5% escalation. Currently, everybody's saying 7 to 8%. If those numbers we're telling you today are 5%, they're not 7 or 8. And in our groups, as we talked, we want to talk with your town finance folks and go, what do we collectively think is the best for your town to carry in your budget? And what are strategies to avoid, God forbid if it keeps going or keeps spiking, and we fall short on the bids come in higher, how do we manage that? And right now, it's just very volatile, and it's
So we
it's
could end
hard.
up back at another referendum, even if we tried to do one referendum and it passed, because we wouldn't have enough monies.
I think it depends how we write the first referendum and how
Correct.
we write some kind of cushion in to protect ourselves from that scenario, because I think that would be a disaster. The thing is, nobody goes to a referendum and votes saying, yes, I want to spend more money. They go and they vote saying, yes, I want to have a transformative school system, because everybody in Weathersfield benefits from great schools. So we do need some help on that, because we can't sell these numbers, but we can sell the great schools. So are we going to have designs of what they might possibly look like, that we can have big posters at the entrance to every single school? Are we going to have, descriptions? Are we going to make some videos as a board where we talk about what we expect to get out of these schools? Because we really need to sell this to people. I don't mean that in any kind of sort of underhanded way, but we need them to understand why this is so exciting and important.
We as a board can't do anything once a referendum is passed,
I know that.
Okay.
So
I'm
this
just
is,
wanna make
but
sure
this
we're
is our
clear.
moment, isn't it? Before it actually goes, before it becomes a referendum. We can discuss it now. We can hopefully promote it now. We all have to be behind it.
You can certainly do renderings, what it might look like. There's pros and cons to that. We've had where we do them, and what happens, you have a different architect, you have a different design, and they go, I voted on that.
Yep.
I didn't vote on that. That's some of the struggle we dealt with in New Hartford. New Fairfield, the last couple of years, we're doing a new high school, and it's different than what the concepts were, and there's some folks who are vocal, but it's still going through. It's still happening. To do that in a couple of weeks would be a pull. We can find people to do it. I'm sure a lot of architects will do it, but that's something I think we've discussed collectively.
Yeah, and I want to add, Jennifer, to your point, I think you're right about having the visual and being able to tell the story. And I mean, I think this data, even here tonight, it tells the story. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is a big lift, and we know it is. I do want to caution with regard to putting out any type of a rendering, because I think back to 2011, when we put the rendering of Weathersfield High School, it was right outside of this council chambers, and it looked one way. And then we got into the issue where we had to go back and do notwithstanding legislation, and we had the cost escalation of somewhere in the range, John, you've been here by about $11 million. And we ended up having to value engineer out some of the very items that we had pitched for this particular project. And I do want to caution everyone that, when we get to the design phase where we're talking with the architect and really getting into what that building will look like, that's where we're going to really see the true renderings. We've done test fits, so you can see what the building kind of looks like, and those test fits are basically buildings from other districts that are currently doing them. But your point is very valid, and I think, again, being here this evening, we have to start looking at these numbers. And I will tell you, as Adam mentioned, with having a conversation with the town, we meet on Friday, and we're going to talk about, some of the basics here as we wrap up the educational specifications for Hanmer and for Highcrest. And sitting in the audience this evening, we have Mr. Cohn, and we also have Ms. Morey. They have been involved in the ed spec process, and it is challenging, because what we want versus what the state will reimburse us for are two different things. The other thing I can share with you today, we actually had a meeting with the state. It was not as large a group from the state as we had hoped it would be, but we did have the conversation with the state. The response I got from the state today is, are you looking to right-size your buildings? That's what they're looking for here, and therein lies the challenge. And as Chuck talked about with Hanmer, the challenge here is we've squeezed down the size, and the last thing I want to do as your superintendent of schools is build a beautiful school that doesn't meet the educational needs of our students. So we've got to strike that balance. And then we also have to look at it from the taxpayer perspective. As Chuck mentioned, you see the difference between what Hanmer was going to be and what Hanmer is potentially going to be with the ed specs. Does the town have the stomach to be able to cover that difference that wouldn't be covered under the reimbursement? You're talking about a potential 10% difference in the reimbursement rate. So that's going to be the piece that we're going to have to address too. So the questions are excellent, and the dialogue is excellent. I know, I can speak to John and Bobby and Janice this year, who've been on the facilities committee, and John and Bobby, you both have been at it since 2018. So we are getting to that point where we want to put forward a grant application and get rolling on this. I will tell you this as well. You can tell me the escalation costs are high right now, they're going to come down. The longer we wait, the more the prices are going to continue to go up. It never, ever gets cheaper. So, thank you.
Mike, I have a question. At our
Sure.
last
Yes, sir.
facilities meeting, we discussed the ed specs and some of the challenges that we were having, and with the principals being involved with our classroom makeup. And correct me, I don't have the right wording, but we had special rooms assigned, and yet the state wasn't quite accepting of those rooms. Is that correct?
Yeah, I understood it that the state has not changed their spec requirements in a very long time. So the idea of going in with some really creative ideas isn't necessarily going to fly.
Well, to that point, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I'd like to be able to have auditoriums in each of our elementary schools, and the state won't even approve a project that has an auditorium. There are many other areas. Let's go back to Weathersfield High School. The pool itself was not a reimbursable cost. It's nice to have. Everybody loves it. The town uses it. Our swim teams use it. But the upgrades we did there were not reimbursable. So we're going to ultimately have to make the decision here as we move forward, as we wrap up these ed specs. Do we have the stomach to be able to overcome the difference in the reimbursement rate? Are we prepared for those other ineligible costs? And we saw them. We saw them with change orders at Weathersfield High School, and we saw them with some of the changes. I think back to we put the panels up to cover the HVAC units at Weathersfield High School. I can remember that vividly, and that was the result of that whole HVAC change. We were originally going to be doing geothermal and tons of photovoltaic, and it got value engineered out because we had to come in within the budget. So we're hoping with this project we're going to be able to develop budgets that are strong, that allow us to avoid any value engineering.
Well, I think the question that we had at our facilities meeting, will the state be updating their specifications as far as the needs in each building? And the needs meaning with the different programs that we offer in our schools today. I think that was our concern.
You want to speak to that?
No, my understanding, I haven't heard from the state if they're going to update the space standards. They have a design guideline that they use to compare, but it's not statutory. The space standard is statutory. I believe it's on the Department of Education, if I'm not mistaken. They can't change that. OSCGR, I think Department of Education, I believe, has to, on that calculation, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any discussion of changing that at this time. It is outdated. I think it doesn't account for, anytime we're in the 50, 60, 70,000 range for a school, it does get a bit challenging. But unfortunately, that's where they're at. I mean, I'm not saying we can't get some of it back in an applied waiver. If I was to say I think we could, I would want to be responsible in saying so. I think you can get some. So, but there's probably going to be a hit to your reimbursement without, I'll say, outside help, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think what we just wanted to make sure, and I think Mike indicated earlier, that what we build is appropriate for what we need to meet our educational requirements in Weathersfield. And I know that with all the challenges over the last few years with COVID and the emotional and social stress that everyone's been under, that creates another layer of fabric that we have to remove. So I think what we have in there are buildings that we're looking for learning environments for students to, excel, and not in a corner in a library, or not in a music room or a leftover locker room that doesn't get used anymore. We just really want to make sure that, we have the right facility for teaching of our kids today.
Do you want to get to your last slide?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Let's see. So the next steps, we only have two more. Go through them. Yeah, no, they're very good. I'm glad we're having them. Again, finalizing the space program aspects. We kind of talked about that in the budgets. Of course, your final review from the Facilities Committee and the Board of Ed is to get the grant application. The full board has to approve that. That is a requirement. You own the ed specs. Then come up is town council approval for holding the referendum. By statute, with a referendum, you can hold a referendum. You can submit this June and hold a referendum as long as you report your findings no later than November 15th of this year, because they have to create, the month later, they have to create the priority list, and so they would need to know that. So they have to vote on that before June 30th, and we have to send that to the state. 3 local resolutions, you probably had them for the high school, allowing the superintendent to submit a grant application, approval of outline specs and schematic drawings, and then you have to establish a building committee. I think there was one already established, but I don't know if we can have a different one or not. So there's just 3 local resolutions. And finally, just submitting the applications for, for the 2 first schools just to kind of clarify, whether you go one or however many referendums you guys decide to go, you don't want to submit those grant applications until you're actually ready to move forward, because once you get a grant commitment, by law, you have 2 years to break ground, otherwise they're going to push you back. So, plus, there's too much potential change between now and then anyway, so. And then this is kind of small, apologize. This is our macro schedule, just kind of outlines the overall linear part of the project. That red line kind of to the left is kind of where we're at in March. There's a kind of a green bar, that's the grant application submission. Assuming a November 8th referendum, that's the star there, and there's a black bar again, sorry it's a little bit small, but that's what we call a non-advocacy period. That's by statute, that you can't, as public officials, use funding to advocate for the project. Your bond counsel will advise on that, and we recommend speaking with them to get the specifics on those. Once the funding's approved, that's when the project really starts in earnest. That's when the project starts, and that's when everything's eligible with the state of Connecticut. We definitely recommend starting in. Some districts wait till they get their grant commitment to go. We're not sure why, but you want to proceed as quickly as possible. We anticipate about an 18-month, 15, 16-month design schedule to design, go through the entire process, get the approval to go to bid with the state. It takes about 2 to 3 months to bid it and get the contract for it. And then looking on this schedule, if everything holds true, starting construction fall of 2024. And then roughly 16, 18 months, we'll be finishing the buildings up at the end of 2025. That period, some folks may say, well, let's move the schools. That's very stressful on your teachers and administration. Those 4 or 5 months afterwards are actually valuable for closing the project out, doing punch lists, commissioning your building, really fine-tuning it, getting it where it needs to be, deliver your furniture. It's going to be a lot less stressful and easier for you especially if you're going to do any redistricting. We definitely recommend waiting to open fall of 2026. It'll give us plenty of time to kind of vet it out and weed all the details out at the end of the project. So, but that's kind of just, again, a real high-level schedule for the first 2 projects, and then if you proceed with the next 2, typically you'd see you'd kind of, sometimes they overlap, depending on when you want to do that.
So that's just the first 2 projects?
That's just the first 2 projects scheduled, correct.
So you're looking at like 2030?
Yes.
Yeah, again, depending on your,
daughter will be out of high school by then.
yeah, they're about roughly 3 to 4-year projects.
Okay.
So, but the next 2 will be one at a time, assuming we use the existing high crest, move them out. It's usually about maybe 2 years that they're going to stay there, move them back in, do a swap, and then again, it all depends on how you proceed.
Does this mean for the Charles Wright students, are they being moved to new schools as their new schools open?
So at the end.
All at the end?
That's why we said
All at the
Landis
end.
will be gone before they even move. 10 years.
Gotcha.
That's
all done.
I'll be paying for college while I'm paying
There's
for
probably
the
not-
tax increase on this too.
Probably not,
Worth it.
one kid born probably almost right now that would be in that school.
Yeah, and I do, if I could please, I do want to say with regard to Charles Wright, is to just remind everybody that Charles Wright doesn't go offline until, a good solid 10 years out. I also want to make sure that everybody in the public is aware of the fact that we did do our due diligence. We tried a test fit of a building on the Charles Wright space. And, we know we have the challenges over at Hanmer with the tight space. Charles Wright was far tighter. It is landlocked. You have only that one section of field behind it. Everybody who's driven up Knott Street at dismissal time in the afternoon knows that the curb cuts are very difficult. We were not able to overcome those. And I would be hard-pressed to believe the state would even approve a renovation project there that it did any type of expansion whatsoever. So I just want to make sure everybody is aware that we did look at that. And also with regard to Phase 1, even though Silas Deane Middle School is not part of any renovation, we did do our due diligence and we did a facilities assessment of Silas Deane to allow physical services to have the ability to know where the priorities were with what needed to be fixed, repaired, replaced. So, for example, one of the priorities that Collier saw with that Phase 1 assessment was roofing over at Silas Deane. So the town actually prioritized a section of roof over the auditorium area and actually replaced that roof section. So we're using the data that we got even for Silas Deane to make informed decisions about how we're doing repairs over at that building. So.
Michael, within that assessment, just once again, I just want to remind people, we also looked at moving sixth grade to the Silas Deane Middle School.
You're correct, sir, absolutely.
So I just
Yes.
wanted to make sure that we did surface that, we reviewed it, and it was just not something that was feasible to take place.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, John. It would have encompassed having to do renovation of the space there, and we were also dealing with the same issue of traffic and traffic flow there being extraordinarily tight. So that was something we looked at.
And to keep Charles Wright open, we had to eminent domain about 8 homes on Knott Street.
Really?
Of course, to get the property for the state to approve a building.
We won't be doing that, just to be clear. No one is losing their home.
No.
So it was either go to school or lose your house.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, great job.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jen.
Let's give our friend a second to zoom us up.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to stay for the rest of the meeting. Jeez.
Be quick.
Time is running.
All right, meetings held, facilities and maintenance, 31422, Mr. Ocasio.
Well, you just heard the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Student programs and services, 31522. Anyone who attended want to report out? Mr. Healy's not here.
I can read the minutes.
We don't need to read the whole minute. You want a synopsis? What,
Charles Wright and Emerson Williams schools reported on year 0 of their goals for the social and emotional learning, academic progress, and also the equity and empathy goal. And they made it very clear, just through the way they explained it, that you really can't separate out these goals. They are really intertwined a great deal. And I think they did an excellent job of explaining what they were doing for each of these things. For the equity and empathy, they were commenting about how the technology that we have now, that they have accessible to them, enables them to communicate with parents no matter what their language is. So they're able to send newsletters in multiple languages on emails, have conferences and conversations through technology using that person's language where there's automatic translation. So it was just really remarkable. One teacher talked about how she was out because her back was bothering her, but she could still be at school with her small group instruction and just really talking to one child at a time or working with one child at a time. So they all mentioned how one thing that they got from the shutdown with COVID was they really learned more about what they can do with technology and a lot of the technology that they're already using. An example is Lexia, a reading program, and they are making much better use of it now than before the shutdown. And it certainly sounds like the level of technology that they're using to improve the academics is just, I'm glad I'm retired. It's really something. And listening to them talk about the social emotional, I just remember reading a lot about how that this is borne out as being a really wonderful support for academics, that children who have that in their curriculum do better academically. And personally, it made me think of how sometimes we have a short attendance memory span. But I remember before the shutdown, there had been an uptick, and correct me if I'm wrong, in suicide rates among school-aged children. And I think that this was, if I am remembering correctly, kind of developed with that in mind. And then, of course, the pandemic made it very important. So those are things that I remember. I don't know if Jennifer remembers some other things.
I think you covered it all. They gave us homework. We all got copies of Joe
Oh,
Brummer's Guide
Yes.
to Trauma and Restorative Practices in Schools. So we all look forward to reading that before the next
Yes.
meeting.
And I did have a question about that. Now, have all of the teachers read that in the entire system, or just the teachers that wanted to be in the book club? Yes.
No, this is our work with building a trauma-informed restorative district. It's across the board. And it encompasses our students, it encompasses our adults as well, and we're learning about this process as well. And the idea of having it go at, year zero is we want to build it. It's a different type of a philosophy, and it's not reducing the level of accountability whatsoever, but it's helping to create a positive relationship for students where they can thrive. And what we think, to your point exactly, Janice, is being able to establish a positive relationship with students and among staff. It ultimately leads to good outcomes with regard to student achievement and equity as well.
It's just, what we had said at the meeting, that you really can't separate those three goals out. They really go hand in hand with each other.
Thank you. John, you want to?
Yes, I guess I can't be neglectful as to the facilities and maintenance meeting, a little formal. Mr. Emmett continues to discuss this with the town council and the current town manager, Bonnie Therian. We at our meeting on the 14th, pretty much got a final update. We narrowed the scope of where we wanted to go. We discussed concerns, and we discussed the costs that you saw today. We also discussed the idea of a single referendum at that meeting, and the ed specs and the student enrollment. At this point, Mr. Emmett had also indicated he's been keeping the PTOs up to date and getting a committee together at both Highcrest and Hamner, and the families involved. So we've got a real good working core group that's going to be started. Our Deputy Mayor, Tom Mazzarella, was present at that meeting, so he certainly had some questions that he was able to discuss at that time and keep it on top of things and being able to bring it back to the town council. So that was a great thing. You heard tonight regarding the grant application, and we have a lot of work to be done. It's a lot of work. It's exciting. The principals were here today. They and their staff put a lot of effort and energy into this program. So we're committed, we're moving forward, and we just have to continue to communicate the issue and the desire, the need that's happening. So.
Thank you. CREC Council, 3/16/22. Ms.
Okay,
Donato.
thank you. The CREC Council met on Wednesday, March 16th in a hybrid format. I attended in person along with my fellow board member, Janice DeRoberts, and I thank her for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The CREC Council is the Capital Region Education Council, of which Weathersfield is a member, along with 35 other surrounding towns, and this council is responsible for the regional magnet schools and Project Choice. They have also organized and work the Hartford Head Start. There was a presentation to the council, and it was an explanation on how the CREC budget is put together. Unlike most towns in Connecticut, CREC builds their budget based on revenues they will receive, which are fees from services, grants, and tuitions, and then programs, leadership, benefit monies are put in place based on projected revenues. Greg Florio, the executive director of CREC, spoke of the mask mandate ending on Monday, March 21st, based on COVID data. He spoke of the upcoming annual CREC meeting and the return of the back-to-school backpack party to be held once again on August 17th. And he also spoke of the very important education bills in the General Assembly right now that would address the tuition and the capital improvement needs of our magnet schools. Lydia Tadone, who's the CREC chair, spoke of meeting and working with legislators on the important education legislation being presented this session. The council heard from their finance committee on the very high cost of health care. Early Childhood Committee spoke on the success of Head Start and the need for more available spots for children birth to age 5 in their program. And the Legislative Committee spoke again of the important legislation, education bills, and the continued concern for the high cost of special ed and its impact on school systems. All policies that were approved by the Policy Committee and had a first reading were passed, and the meeting ended with comments from different town reps. I requested that this council have a presentation on the progress of the residency program, which is in its first year, and Weathersfield has 2 student teachers in this residency program. And for any more information on CREC and any detailed minutes from these meetings, please visit their website. Thanks.
Thank you. Finance and Operations was canceled. Meeting scheduled. Weathersfield Early Childhood Collaborative on 4/18/22 at 4:30. Student Programs and Services, 4/19/22 at 6 p.m. CREC Council, 4/20/22 at 11:30 a.m. And Finance and Information, 4/26/22, 6 p.m. There is no unfinished business. Public comment. Seeing no public comment is closed. Board comment. Anyone in the board wishing to make comment? Yes, Lena.
Okay, I have a few things from the high school. So the first thing is that last Tuesday, we held our first 8th grade family night for all incoming freshmen. So there were club tables, tours, and presentations for the families to experience. And based on the videos we got, the kids had a really great time. There were actually over 90 students and staff volunteers from our high school to make the night possible. So there's interviews on the Blue Eagle page, and also on our website you can find the presentations that the principal and vice principal gave. And also recently we had 2 different initiatives to support Ukraine. One of our teachers, Mr. Sand, his current issue students sold t-shirts, while other Ukrainian students and their friends started monetary collections in the CAF. And after everything, they raised over $1,000 for the Ukrainian National Home Relief Fund. So that was such a wonderful turnout, and they were all really pleased with that. And of course, if you missed last week's episode of Blue Eagle News, it's one you probably don't want to miss because it was hosted by Jimmy Clark, who you all know is our sports speaker at our school, and our very own principal, Miss O'Connor. So if you'd like to check it out, it'll be on our Blue Eagles YouTube page. So.
Thank you. Any other board members wishing to make comment? Yes, Bobby.
No, you go ahead.
All right. Well, I have a few here, and I'm looking at that clock. The Kenine Kids Coalition had a Zoom meeting on Thursday, March 10th, and our after-school program is organized and mostly funded and run by the Keene Foundation. Caroline Fazina gave a report that the midwinter spring session has 850 enrollments. The Keene Foundation also had a hands-on learning science enrichment program that's working in our elementary schools. So far, all the 6th and the 5th grades have participated, and 50% of the 4th graders, a total of 27 classrooms, have been involved in learning science through this hand-on approach. And this is possible through a Weathersfield Together community grant from the Hartford Foundation for Giving through the Keene Foundation. Very interesting, the Weathersfield Police Department is working to establish a police athletic league program for our students. This program has been proposed by our new police chief and will be implemented by officers Eric Knapp and Manny Silva. More information will follow as this community program gets started. And the Keene Foundation will continue their fundraising through their May 16th golf tournament, the 5K on June 5th, and the always popular Carnival in October. We also heard from Park and Rec, as this is a coalition, as they get started on their town summer programs. I had never heard of this, but a very popular event, the Fishing Derby, will be held at the Spring Street Pond on April 23rd. Social Services spoke to the youth survey that we heard the results here, and they're being used, the results are being used to bring in speakers for our students. They continue activities at Silas Deane Middle School and will be giving out camper scholarships for this summer. The library's back to in-person events. The Friends Book Sale is May 20th, 21st, and 22nd. And now, most interesting activities up. Our Town, the movie with Hal Holbrook, will be the focus of a collaboration of the library, the Historic Society, and Weathersfield High School. Please watch for more info on this most interesting activity. And all the info I just gave you can also be found and more on the websites of all the Keen on Kids Coalition group sites.
Thank you. Anyone else
So you
wishing to
want to
make
go, and
comment?
I'll have a finishing comment after.
Oh, well,
that. Okay.
My comment was a little bit flippant, I suppose, but I just, much as I miss our colleagues, Mr. Riley, Mr. Healy, and Mr. Lacavoli, I just wanted to comment what a pleasure it is to see a female majority sitting on these benches. And happy Women's History Month to all of you. As a woman and a historian, it's a special month for me, and I just wanted to wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I have one thing.
Yes, Ms. Drew.
I just wanted to thank the administration in regards to their continual upgrade in regards to what activities students are able to have, you know, as the numbers are decreasing. The middle school, which I think has been hit the hardest, they will be having dances where they will be able to socialize and like actually be, you know, with each other. I'm not sure if they're gonna be able to talk to each other, but they'll be there together. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate it, and as a mom, I'm really happy that hopefully these kids are coming back to normal. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Grant, did you have something else? Did I cut you off? I
do.
apologize. Go
Can
ahead. Yes.
This is a little bit long, but this is something that has been bothering me for a little bit, and I want to have my final remarks focus on an outstanding Weathersfield organization, and truly one of my favorite organizations in this town, and it's Dollars for Scholars. It was founded in 1974 by Dr. Phil Sale and Felix Babel to provide one-time scholarships to our graduating seniors and plan to pursue any form of post-secondary education. This nonprofit organization is managed by volunteers and scholarships and are funded entirely by donations from local residents and businesses. You know, and I'm really proud to say that I created a scholarship in the name of Hughes Brothers, which is in memory of my dad and his brothers, World War II vets, who lived in, worked in, and loved this town. I've also taken the many opportunities to be part of their biggest fundraiser, which is their annual golf tournament. And like a reunion, townspeople come to play golf, enjoy friends, spend money for our graduating seniors. It's an excellent example of what makes Weathersfield such a special place. But recently, it came to my attention that there was a Dollars for Scholars board vote on residency for our Weathersfield High School graduating seniors. This vote was brought about because a small number of our graduates are Project Choice students, students whose families live in neighboring communities, and these families have taken the opportunity through CREC to send their children to the Weathersfield schools to become part of a highly valued school system. Our Project Choice students become part of the fabric of our schools. They participate in every opportunity our schools offer: academics, clubs, sports, after-school activities, and friendships. These students will always hold themselves up as Weathersfield students, which will be a point of pride for them, as it should be for us. The Dollars for Scholars Board recently voted to keep the residency wording in their organization statement. This vote will keep Weathersfield Choice students from being eligible for Dollars for Scholars monies. And it's an absolute nonsense, the argument that local businesses and residents who have supported this charity for years would now pull their support out because they learned that 4 or maybe 5 Weathersfield students from nearby communities are being considered for a Weathersfield High School Senior Dollars for Scholars scholarship. I find this argument is nonsense. I would ask everyone, and hope everyone will, do that the Dollars for Scholars revisit this issue of residency. Remember that all Weathersfield graduating students deserve the helping hand of a community that wants to send them off in the most generous way we know, with a great education, with our pride in them, our wish for their future success, and a Dollars for Scholars award. So please consider using your voice to contact our Dollars for Scholars board and ask them to reconsider their vote. Thank you.
I think if I can tag along on that, so I was on the WSPC before I was elected, but I still attend their meetings, and this was a large contention that we've had for a number of months, and we've been going back and forth with the Dollars for Scholars. And one of the issues is that these students, because they've chosen to come to Weathersfield, are not entitled to any Hartford dollars. So they are stuck in the middle. They can't get Weathersfield Dollar for Scholars, and they can't get Hartford. So even though they are here, and sometimes they're here from kindergarten on, they're unable to receive the funds that they so deserve, or that they even have the opportunity to receive. And I'm very disheartened in regards to the response that was given to the WSPC from Dollars for Scholars. It's a little shameful the way that they are treating some of our students.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to make comments? Yes, Mr.
Just going to
Roberts.
say, I appreciate that you said our students, because that's exactly what they are. They are our students, and they deserve everything that all of our students have coming to them.
Thank you. Thanks. Please write to them.
Anyone else? All right. Lena, great job in Cinderella.
Thank you.
I got there on Saturday night. Also want to congratulate the dance team on their, I believe they won the state championship. I know Mr. Emmer alluded to them. And congratulations to the boys hockey team who won the state championship last night. And they got a fire truck, police escort pretty much all the way home from Hamden, and then from the South State Highway to the high school. So it was a pretty exciting event. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? Motion carries.